2021 Planning Commission meeting. I'd like to call this meeting to order. My name is Chris Ramey, and I'm the chair of the Eugene Planning Commission. Thank you for joining us in this remote meeting format we're using in response to Governor Brown's Stay Home, Save Lives order. The format enables the Planning Commission to meet, hear from the community, and take care of business while keeping its members, staff, and public safe. Tonight, we are holding a public hearing to consider amendments to land use code related to minimum setbacks for commercially zoned properties. And following that, our second item will be a discussion on the clear and objective project. Ahead of these items, however, we've reserved 10 minutes for public comment. The public may comment on any matter except for items scheduled for a public hearing or public hearing items for which the record has already closed. Generally, the time limit for public comment is 3 minutes. However, the Planning Commission reserves the option to reduce the time allowed each speaker based on the number of people requesting to speak. Anyone wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on channel 21, or by following the access instructions listed on the agenda for this meeting. There are different ways to raise your hand depending on how you are participating. For those joining us on a computer, tablet, or other smart device, you can raise your hand by clicking the hand icon at the bottom of the screen or by opening the participant window. For those joining by phone, please dial *9, after which you should hear audio confirmation of your hand being raised. If you wish to speak about an item that is not scheduled for tonight's hearing and you have not already raised your virtual hand, please raise your virtual hand now. While individuals are working to raise their hands, I want to let you know a bit about the Planning Commission and our role. We are unpaid volunteers appointed by the City Council to 4-year terms to the Commission. We all live and work in Eugene like many of you. We directly advise our City Council on all matters related to land use, and we are also tasked with making certain land use decisions on behalf of our City Council. We're responsible for upholding the laws of our city and our state, the policies of our City Council, and of course, at the same time, we're also responsible to everyone that lives and works in Eugene. We're at-large members, which means that we have to consider the needs of the community as a whole, as well as the needs of all groups and neighborhoods. We're also human beings, which means each of us has a personal view that makes us who we are. But as planning commissioners, we're committed to balancing all of our needs as a community and to making the best decisions we possibly can based on our policies and our laws for us and for future generations. This can be tough to do, and we know not everyone will agree with every decision we make. So as we proceed today, we want you to know up front that we are listening and that we care deeply about you and our community. We will continue to listen carefully and hear your concerns and your hopes. Even though we may or may not be able to do what you want, you will be heard, and we will strive to make the best decision possible. So now, do we have anyone signed up, anyone raising their hands for our public comment portion?
We don't have anybody with their hands up.
Okay. Well, then we're going to jump right into tonight's hearing. Tonight's hearing will begin with a presentation from staff, and then we'll open the public hearing. Then those who wish to speak during the public hearing will be asked to virtually raise your hand. I will also ask the individuals to limit their testimony to 3 minutes to allow everyone a chance to speak this evening. If you wish to speak during the public hearing portion of the meeting, please raise your virtual hand now. And just a reminder that the Planning Commission will not make a final decision on the proposed code amendments. Instead, we will make a recommendation to the City Council, who will hold their own public hearing before making a final decision. Before we start the hearing, I want to thank everyone again for their patience and flexibility as we work within this virtual meeting format. As always, feel free to contact staff if there is testimony you are not able to provide or wish to get to us in a different manner. And now Althea Sullivan will walk us through the staff presentation before we open the public hearing.
Thank you, Commissioner Ramey. I'm going to share my screen with you all. Are you all able to see a slide that says commercial setbacks? All right, I'm getting thumbs up. So good evening, everyone. My name is Althea Sullivan. I'm a senior planner with the city's planning division. This item is a public hearing on a land use code amendment to commercial setback standards that was unanimously initiated by City Council. Tonight I'll provide some background that has led up to the draft code that is before you at this hearing. And then following that, I will provide a little bit of information on the next steps. At a work session last September, Council picked up a conversation that began in 2017 about commercial setbacks. This conversation continued to focus on the importance of creating vibrant streetscapes and a walkable pedestrian environment. Council expressed concern with the setback standards that are currently in our code today for commercial properties. The concerns expressed by Council focused on particular buildings in Eugene that were built next to our public sidewalks. In the examples that Council discussed, two general themes emerged. First, we had the example of a residential building next to the public sidewalk where someone walking along the street could look directly into a living space, creating a privacy concern. This scenario was of particular concern in our downtown area, where many of our adopted plans and documents focus on the creation of walkable spaces for individuals to enjoy our downtown, and having someone look into a living space sits at odds with these goals. The second scenario we heard about was the example where a commercial building sits directly on the sidewalk, but is located on a busy street. The concern here is that it results in pedestrians feeling stuck between a building and a street with traffic moving at high speeds. Many of our guiding documents note the importance of having buildings along the streets to allow for people to shop and easily enter commercial buildings. However, this vision of the walkable urban environment works best in places like our downtown, where vehicle speeds are slower and sidewalks are often wider. This table shows the setback standards that are currently in our code for commercial zones. Before I get into the specifics of the setbacks, I want to share a little bit about each of these zones. So the first zone on the left is our C1 neighborhood commercial zone. And then on the far right is the GO, which is our general office zone. These zones tend to be scattered throughout the city. And the best example in my mind of the intent of the C1 zone is to facilitate small scale commercial uses, such as a store where you could walk to pick up something you forgot, or a small restaurant that sits within your neighborhood. The general office zone is intended to allow a mix of residential and office uses and has standards to reduce building heights and bulk to facilitate both of those uses existing together. And then looking at the middle of the table, we have our C2 and C3. So our C2 zone is community commercial and tends to be located along our corridors where some of our more extensive commercial developments are. And then our C3 is primarily located in our downtown core. There is a small area of C3 over by the U of O, but when you think C3, I would think downtown core area. With that C3 zone, we tend to vision people visiting several businesses or walking between those different areas. As I already talked about, the Eugene Code currently allows for buildings to be built to the property line in both C2 and C3, whereas C1 and GO both have a 10-foot minimum front yard setback. And then the other piece I will note about C2 and C3 is there are not specific design requirements tied to that allowance to build to the property line. We do have a variety of guiding documents on the topic, such as the Community Design Handbook, and I will also note that work is currently being done to update our standards for streets in the new Complete Street Design Guide. Those documents exist today, and this land use code amendment that's before you is a separate effort that Council initiated back in September of 2020. And then just for a little bit of context, can you all see my mouse when I move it on the screen? Okay, so this lighter pink color is showing the areas of C2. So you can see that extending Highway 99. Here's West 11th. Then we have more C2 scattered out the Coburg area. And then River Road has some patches of C2. And then if you can see here, it's a darker pink or red color, that's our downtown core area, and that's where most of our C3 sits. And then I will move into the draft code. Something I'll note is that council did ask that we move quickly with this code amendment. And in an effort to do that, we started with focus groups that were comprised of design professionals in our community to provide feedback on initial concepts for how to address the issues that council raised. We understood that our framework for the code amendment was to require buildings and commercial zones to be set back, to require landscaping and pedestrian amenities, and in some circumstances, allow for buildings to be closer to the street when specific design features are provided to ensure a walkable street environment. I will note that we started with the group of local professionals because their experience and input is often really relevant in helping staff to identify problems with draft code early on. We did hire a consultant, Ellen Kennedy, with Cogito Partners to help facilitate the 2 focus group meetings and provide a written report of the feedback. So this next slide, this captures the initial code concepts that we provided to our focus groups, and we kept those fairly simple in the interest of moving quickly with a code amendment. We started with a 5-foot setback for both C2 and C3, as they were the commercial zones that currently allow for a building to be built to the property line. Additionally, we added landscaping and enhanced pedestrian spaces for the area between the building and the property line. So that would sit in this new minimum setback area that would be required. We offered exceptions, which you can think of as a trade of design features for an allowance to build closer to the property line. For buildings with ground floor commercial, we thought about some of the examples in our downtown, like the corner where Sill sits, and thought that a higher ground floor ceiling height with requirements for transparent windows made sense and would help to create an environment where people would feel welcome to enter buildings and shop. For ground floor residential, we considered privacy and what options were available through code to mitigate a window being built next to the street where someone could look into someone's living space. We offered up vertical separation where the ground floor of the building would be lifted to at least 3 feet above grade. And we also considered setting a minimum windowsill height of 6 feet, which would reduce the ability for most people to be able to look into a window. What I will note about both of those options is that those are exceptions that would live within the code. So those would be something where someone could trade those design features and still go directly to building permit. Another consideration that we had was what happens when someone has a unique site or proposes a creative design. In the interest of maintaining the flexibility, we made sure to keep the option of an adjustment review for all of these standards. Adjustment reviews are a land use application, and while we understand that they do have a cost and take time from a project, there are some circumstances where creating clear exceptions, we couldn't figure out the way to do it for every single site. So that adjustment review is kind of the option if someone proposes something or has a unique site and a unique design to allow that project to move forward. So this is the feedback that we heard from focus groups. Overall, focus groups expressed an interest in improving our community through better design and recognize that there are some buildings and streets that could have been better designed. Of course, they also recognize that the land use code is just one of the many tools available to help create a walkable pedestrian environment. Many of the individuals we spoke with offered up general suggestions of ideas in addition to providing feedback on concepts. Starting with general feedback, we clearly heard from focus groups that downtown and corridors are both unique and each have their own characteristics. We also heard that residential and commercial uses function differently and should be recognized, and that should be recognized. In keeping with recognizing the unique characteristics of different types of development and places, it was noted that the amendments should recognize those unique features and make efforts to not use a one-size-fits-all approach. A point that was heavily emphasized was the importance of the public realm. I will note that we do have changes coming to the design for streets in the Complete Street Design Guide, which is kind of the public side of addressing this issue. The other piece is our land use code, which is where the draft code is focused. Some of the feedback we heard was specific to the initial code concepts proposed by staff. Some of the concerns that we heard were specific to dimensions, which I will discuss more in detail later when I actually get to what the draft code is that was before you. Something that we did hear from the focus group strongly was that minimum windowsill height was a bad idea. I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but that was very clear from the groups. The focus groups and council at a work session also flagged the potential for vertical separation to create an issue from an ADA perspective. And I'll discuss that more later as well. Overall, from the focus groups, we heard that good design is created between the interplay between the public and private realms. And while we heard that additional code standards may not be the desirable outcome for the development community, there was general support for improving design and an understanding that code standards are one option available to do that. So this is starting with the draft code and an overview of what's before you today. So when we heard from focus groups the importance of separating C2 and C3, we thought this made sense and revised our draft to treat the two zones differently. This is because of the general locations of C2 along corridors, while C3 is in our downtown. As I have mentioned, our corridors tend to have higher vehicle speeds, and we thought that a 5-foot setback would help to create a space that felt secure for pedestrians, while 3 feet seemed reasonable in our downtown, where vehicle speeds tend to be lower and we tend to have wider sidewalks. I will add that at the council work session earlier this year, we did hear general support for the concept of a 5-foot and 3-foot setback. At the work session, we also heard concern about when the standards would apply and the potential to create a scenario where an existing building could not expand if these standards applied. When staff thought about the applicability of the new standards, what we thought was reasonable was that the new standards would apply to new buildings or the linear expansion of a building that's at least 100% of the facade of the building. So thinking of a building kind of creeping out across a street. So this slide shows a representation of the new default setback standard that could exist. I will note this graphic is a slightly better depiction of what would show up along a corridor, but you can see the building is pushed back. There's some landscaping and a pedestrian space. So now I'm going into the exceptions, and these are, again, by right, someone could choose to follow the exception and they could go in with a building permit and not need an adjustment review. I kind of think of these as a trade for design features, or a trade of design features to be able to move your building closer to the property line. When we initially proposed this concept, we were considering a requirement of a minimum ceiling height of 14 feet citywide with windows. In response to the feedback that recognized that our downtown is different from our corridors, we made the allowances for buildings to get closer to the property line context specific. For buildings with ground floor commercial in our downtown, we set a 12-foot minimum ground floor ceiling height with window requirements being set at 75%. I will note both of these dimensions come from our Broadway area overlay zone, which is the area that sits along Broadway Street and has a high concentration of commercial developments. For ground floor commercial in C2, we reduced the ground floor ceiling height to 10 feet and the window percentages to 60%. We also heard a question from the focus groups about how do you measure ground floor ceiling height? So we added a definition that's in the draft code to clearly define that. And then these two pictures are from our downtown and generally represent what we think could be built under the standards. And I will note again, this would be without an adjustment review. So someone could just turn in their building permit for that. For ground floor residential on property zone C2 or C3, we again thought about how to create a clear exception to allow for a building to move closer to the property line. We clearly heard from the focus groups that window sill height was a bad idea, which is why we took that out of the code entirely. We did keep vertical separation, which seemed like the one option to create a separation of the space if someone wanted to place a building closer to the property line. We understand that this option comes with concerns about cost and ADA considerations. That said, staff thought that having the building higher was the best option to address the privacy concerns that we heard from council. With the concerns about accessibility from the ADA perspective, we did exempt shared lobbies and building entrances from the vertical separation requirement. This means that while the building itself would need to be lifted, a shared lobby could be put on the building or an entrance could be put there that would be at grade. And then as you entered into the building, you could use ramps or lifts or elevators to bring someone up to that 3-foot elevation. And there may be some other creative ways to do that. That was just kind of our initial thought on how that might look. And again, I will note that the vertical separation piece would only come into play when someone elected to move their building closer to the street. So if they stayed at the property, or if they stayed 3 feet from the property line in C3, or 5 feet from the property line in C2, vertical separation would not be something that would come up at all. Oh, and I guess the one other thing I will add here is that when we were thinking about this, the downtown area, you could go to the property line, and then along the C2 area, you cannot go all the way to the property line. And we thought that that was reasonable. It would leave 2 feet between your building and the property line. And we thought that was reasonable given the narrower sidewalks and generally higher speeds in those corridor areas. So this slide shows a representation of what that could look like. So this area shows that entrance at the grade, so you could enter the building, and then inside you would be able to go up into those units where that ground floor would sit. And finally, something I think that is worth highlighting is the fact that the setback standards are adjustable through our adjustment review process. We did our best to come up with some clear exceptions, which I just discussed, to allow for the buildings to move closer to the property line and also be eligible to go directly to a building permit. That said, I think it is likely that projects or sites in the future will be unique and may benefit from requesting an adjustment. I think I've talked about adjustment review enough, but I'd be happy to answer questions about that in discussion later. The final piece that I will note about the draft code is that we did add landscaping and enhanced pedestrian space requirements to both the C1 and GO zone. We understood our direction to be citywide, and we thought that if we were adding those to C2 and C3, we may as well add those to C1 and GO as well. So next steps, this evening is the public hearing where individuals will have the opportunity to provide comments to the Planning Commission about the proposed code amendments. Following any testimony, I would be happy to answer questions. I will note that there is a second item on our agenda tonight, and we do have June 7th set for deliberations on commercial setbacks. So depending on our time, we may be able to get fairly far into the deliberations on commercial setbacks, or we may, I may ask that you provide me with focused questions or ask for specific information so that I can provide you the materials that you would like be ahead of that June 7th meeting. At the June 7th meeting, there will be deliberations and a recommendation for City Council. And then the City Council public hearing on this item is currently scheduled for July 19th. And if anyone has additional testimony that does not come in this evening, it can be provided to the councilors ahead of that public hearing or at that public hearing. Thank you all for listening, and I will stop sharing my presentation here. All right, and back to you, Commissioner Ramey.
Thank you, very helpful. Now we're going to move on to the public hearing portion of the evening. I'm going to open the public hearing. If you want to speak and have not already raised your hand, please raise your virtual hand now. Again, you can raise your hand by clicking the hand icon if you're on a computer, or by dialing *9 if you're joining by phone. We encourage you to submit any written testimony you have as well. Testimony presented at this public hearing should be directed towards the applicable approval criteria or other criteria that the speaker believes applies to the decision. The applicable approval criteria for this proposed land use code amendment are from Eugene Code Section 9.8065, which states that a land use code amendment must be 1. Consistent with applicable statewide planning goals as adopted by the Land Conservation and Development Commission. 2. Consistent with applicable provisions of the comprehensive plan and applicable adopted refinement plans. And 3. In the case of establishment of a special area zone, the proposed land use code amendment must be consistent with EC 9.3020 criteria for establishment of an S special area zone. City staff will announce the first person to give testimony as well as the person next in the speaker's queue. Limit your testimony to 3 minutes to allow everyone a chance to speak this evening. When it's your turn to speak, staff will unmute you. As a reminder, please begin by stating your full name and address before beginning your testimony. Do we have anyone with their hand raised who would like to testify this evening?
We do not have anybody.
Okay.
I will note as well, I did not receive any emails or testimony ahead of this meeting.
Or any written testimony. Okay. Very well then. We're going to close this portion of the meeting. I'm going to close the public hearing. And we will now consider any testimony. Oh, let's see. Sorry. The public hearing is now closed. The Planning Commission will consider any testimony received by 5 p.m. on June 6th in making our recommendation to City Council. This is presuming we're meeting on June 7th to continue our deliberations, which I think is accurate. Testimony received after that date will be provided to City Council during the Council public hearing process. Because we have a second item on our agenda tonight, I want to ask commissioners to do their best to focus questions on any additional materials or information we need from staff for our deliberations. We can begin some of our deliberations this evening as time allows, but we also have another meeting for deliberations on June 7th, as I noted, when we will make a recommendation to Council on the commercial setback land use code amendment. Now, would any commissioners care to speak? Ask questions, direct questions to staff. I have Commissioner Taylor, followed by Edwards.
Hi, thank you. Althea, great presentation. Just a couple of questions. One, I'm just curious what the intention was around adding the definition of vertical separation when it seems like you could just state what the definition is. I'm just curious why that term was introduced because it is somewhat complicated. And I guess my recommendation would be if it's not serving a greater purpose than the rest of the code, I think why complicate it? So that would, but that's deliberation. So I guess that's a question. I also wanted to, in subsection, so under the general sections, under the subsection B1, that starts to get into the new proposed code language about the minimum landscape standards. It says, except for paved pedestrian walkways, building entrances, and enhanced pedestrian space. So the way I read that, I just want to clarify that essentially you could actually have no landscaping. You could provide that pedestrian space. Yet I don't see any language actually explicitly explaining what that is. So I just wanted to know, is that intentional? So there's a part as a user of the code that came up for me that that's my assumption. I'd need to double check it. And then what is it? So, and I use other sections of the code to get to what pedestrian amenities. Usually it's 2 or 3 pedestrian amenities and kind of we grab. So I don't know if you want more clarity there, but I just wanted you to know there's some subjectivity in that. It seems like it's, and maybe that was intentional. So I guess I would love some kind of explanation around that. The other is you did describe, I was really curious about where the height, ground floor height came from and the percentages of windows. So I guess I'd love a little bit more explanation of that. It sounds like Broadway established the 12-foot and 75% in C3. Just want a little bit understanding of what design, like what motivated those dimensions and percentages to make sure we haven't outpriced. Because as you know, the construction industry, there's kind of standards. Did we just bump it to the next lumber size? I just like to understand where these things come from. And if they're somewhat arbitrary, doing a little bit more research to make sure that we've landed on something that actually works well for not only achieving what the city council would like us to achieve, but also achieves, all of the other balanced things we're trying that, the development community, anybody is trying to, that's trying to build can kind of achieve. The other is, I noticed the adjustment review, sorry, one more and that's it. Adjustment review for downtown. It looks like the adjustment review for downtown, you can adjust the minimum and maximum front yard setbacks, but you can't adjust the landscape standards. So I guess I'm curious about that. So if you adjust, you kind of almost have to, right? If you're adjusting down to a 0 setback, you no longer have the landscape standards. So I'm just curious, there's a little bit of a disconnect potentially there. So just wanted to bring that up. Because you can't do both, right? You can't meet the landscape standards and have a 0 setback. Yeah.
So do you want to respond to any of those quickly or just keep going? I see you writing them all down, so maybe.
Sure, I guess I have some quick responses to a couple of those, and I'll just be conscious of time. So first, the question about that subsection that was talking about, and it reads, except for paved pedestrian walkways, building entrances, and enhanced pedestrian space. We do, and I think you probably looked for those definitions in the Eugene code. And so that's what the thought is with that chunk of code, is that it would be those features that we have definitions for. And then the other piece about vertical separation, that definition came out of just conversations about how do you measure it and how do you make sure it's clear what you're measuring that to. So kind of without the definition, if you had a building and the grade looked different on one side of the building from the other, well, where do you measure that vertical separation to? So that was kind of the thought with adding the definition there. And I have your other questions and I'll get your responses to those too.
Okay, I've got Commissioner Edwards and then Commissioner Borowski.
Thank you, Chair Ramey. That was a great presentation. I really appreciate the photos and the depictions. It's very helpful because as I was reading through all the code language, it actually really is helps to clarify what you know, what that looks like. I have a really simple question. You mentioned a couple times the windowsill height was something that was made clear that was a bad idea to put some parameters around that. And I was just curious, like what was the feedback in particular that you received on that issue?
Sure. So if you picture a building with this, you go up 6 feet and that's where your windowsill height is. Something that was pointed out to us by the focus groups is you could still have on the inside of that building, that floor could be level with the outside. And so now you have kind of this weird basement-y first floor scenario. And then the focus groups also, they just didn't really think that solved the issue. And they felt like kind of those cost pieces for creating that scenario were expensive and didn't do much for that concern that we heard.
That is very helpful. Thank you. That's all I had.
Commissioner Borowski, followed by Commissioner Beeson.
Thank you, Althea, for the presentation. Yeah, I've been following this, gosh, back since 2017 when it first came to light at the council work sessions. And I think you did a very good job of responding to the specific direction that you were given from council. Unfortunately, in my opinion, it was a very narrow set of directions and a very short time frame to do it in. And for me, that sometimes I think can lead to unintended consequences. So I'm having some issues with this. You know, it seems like you've worked through a lot of the issues that were brought up in the focus groups, but fixing design standards in code, I think, is complex, as you alluded to. And there are differences between residential and commercial, corridors, downtown, and this is to me, this is a very complex issue. The idea that you can go to adjustment review is a nice out, but that also has complications that are unintended as well. Adjustment reviews can be appealed, which adds, if it is appealed, it could add time and money to projects. So that's giving me pause on this whole concept. I think like I said, I think you did a really good job on it. One of the questions that I had, and I don't know if it was looked into or thought of, was if, let's say, for example, a residential, downtown residential, or even C3 residential were put in, could the upper floors go to the lot line? I know that there's areas in Europe where the sidewalk and the pedestrian areas are set back, but then you go up, if you're up 1 or 2 floors, they come back out. And that also almost gives you a portico type of a situation, which is more pedestrian friendly and gives more usable space to the developers. Was that something that was thought about or could happen in any of these scenarios?
I think that's a really good question. I know we definitely talked about it a decent bit, and kind of I guess I'll touch back on vertical separation a little bit too. Part of the definition, I know it was thrown out there of like, what if you build down instead of up as well? But anyways, this concept of having that building sit over the street came up as well. I think the way that I currently would read this code standard is that it would be the building itself needs to be set back, so it would not have that building overhang. But you know, if that's something that the commission had interest in, we could certainly take a look at what may come out of changing that.
And my thinking behind this is that we may be able to achieve some of the goals that were put forward by council. Council doesn't, I'll put it out there, council doesn't want capstone built again. But also by doing this, we are taking away buildable space from a lot of people's property. You know, it may be only 3 feet, but 3 feet on a 5-story building is a fair amount of square footage that is being taken away from a person's property. So I would like to see any way that we could possibly make that recommendation, which would make for a friendly pedestrian environment, yet also maintain some of the property owners' rights to their property and the developability of their property. Thank you.
I've got Commissioner Beeson followed by a second round for Taylor.
Thanks. First off, thank you, Althea, for the presentation. I'm going to echo what others have said. I appreciate very much the written material that you gave to us and the detail that was there, the organization. I really do. And some of the links that you supplied, or at least one of the links back to the council work session, I think you guys are, do that more and more in some of the material. And I appreciate it a lot. So I like the slides. I like the presentation. I think all of that is really helpful to get us kind of centered into the same place. So I'm going to resist giving a lot of opinions and going into deliberation. I'll be careful. I have quite a few thoughts about it, and I'm generally in favor of it and think it's a pretty good idea. I have 2 questions. In the spirit of asking questions, I'm going to reference the page number in the, the page number in the AIS, page 8 of 17. So on there, it's item B. I guess it's just the second page of the code, and you talk about the it talks about the setback requirements and so on. To read my notes, where it says it'll apply to any new building or to the extent that they're, adding to a building and extending it. And if they extend the facade by 100%, I'm sure there's good reason for that. It makes sense. I just found myself continually coming back to that as I read the material and wondering, well, if it's a 150-foot long building or 100-foot long and they're adding 100 feet, I mean, one of the things we're trying to get to, and not to reference capstone again, but something like that, would be, on an addition like that, why would we take it all the way to double the size? Why not cut it off a little sooner and require them to comply with the code? That would be one question. The other one, page 10 of 17, it's the new C, I guess, new C under, I didn't write out all the linkages here. It's up at the top of the page where it talks about the setback being measured from a front lot line abutting the street and or from the edge of the sidewalk furthest from the curb. I guess my main question when I tried to sort through all that, what we were trying to do there, I find myself wondering, well, why don't we just require the 3 or the 5 foot setback from the property line and just leave it at that? The idea of the property side edge of the sidewalk, it could be, I think, in a number of different places. And I think if we're trying to accomplish, and also, I guess, in terms of being able to allow the owner of the property to, under the code, utilize the property to its best advantage, it just seems to me it might be good to just sort of limit that or clarify it to be, I'm wondering, I guess that's the question, why not require it from the property line as opposed to the edge of the sidewalk, or give him a choice? So those 2 questions.
I'm happy to provide. I do have a short response. As far as the measurement, a lot of that text comes from existing code. And so we were tasked with kind of getting this done and moving quickly. We could certainly look into the possibility of changing the way that's measured, but when things already exist in the code, if we go and start kind of tinkering with different pieces, sometimes that creates this cascading effect that has unintended consequences. So we didn't touch it for that reason.
Okay, that's fair enough.
Commissioner Taylor.
Commissioner Isaacson, have you spoken yet? I'm fine because I'm second round.
Right.
Do you, okay. Do you want to go? Or
Sure. I mean,
you go.
I have one quick comment and actually two questions. I'm solidly in favor of Commissioner Broski's comment about an overhang, especially as it relates to balconies, because a lot of these buildings we see have essentially a very flat face to them going up, as opposed to having some character, I guess is a way of putting it, and balconies are one way of doing that. And otherwise, you're cannibalizing the living space to put that balcony in if you have to have a flat facade. So if the rest of the commission's open to his suggestion, I would be as well. The other question I have is, speaking of unintended consequences, have we looked at how these changes might impact the need to revise our sign code as it relates to sandwich boards? If you're a business and you want to attract more attention, you're going to put a sign that's going to be closer to the sidewalk, and now that's going to be encroaching. But if your property line is the space between where the sidewalk is where the building starts, I would assume that you own that and you can do, to a certain degree, what you want on it. So how does that impact the plans here, and whether or not we have to revisit this at some point?
I don't have an answer off the top of my head for the sign question. I rarely see that, but we have some staff here that look at signs all the time, and I'd be happy to check with them. And they have looked at the draft code, but I don't know that we contemplated the sign question, so I can certainly follow up on that.
And if I may,
Sure.
Commissioner Isaacson, just in terms of the comments about balconies, one of the things that may not be obvious, but is part of our existing code, which we're relying on, is what we call permitted intrusions, right? So there are certain design features, elements of a building that would be allowed within the setback, and typically above grade balconies, things of that nature are already addressed in our code. We can come back with more information about that. In terms of the larger question about, cantilevering, say, for above the first or second floor, perhaps for the rest of the building going up, I think we would want to take that kind of a design question back out for more feedback, just in terms of the potential for it to create a canyon effect, and the shade, the effect on the pedestrian environment. That openness would be something that we would want to look at a lot closer. I do respect and understand the concern, which we heard from feedback group focus groups in the feedback in terms of the development potential. And so really that's why we focused pretty heavily on those clear exceptions, right? So the notion is that yes, the setback, the default would reduce that building footprint overall. But in the context of a C2 and C3 zone, we're talking about a building height of 120 to 150 feet. We're creating exceptions that would clearly, clear and objective way with certain design features allow them to get back to 0 foot setback, right? Without the need for an adjustment. So it's not necessarily a given outcome that development potential would be reduced, even with a fairly streamlined approach going straight to building permit or through adjustment review. So we were very mindful of trying to mitigate that potential impact on development potential through those exceptions.
Okay, Commissioner Taylor.
Right, thank you. I wanted to express also my interest in, thank you, Gabe. I do think in the context of in the context of these corridors and downtown, I would encourage and support Commissioner Borofsky's proposal and looking at design options in the upper floors to getting back to the 0 lot line. I think it can still, especially because where you have the exemptions of 12 and 70% and 10 and 60%, or sorry, 12 and 75, that there's going to be a higher ceiling height. Anyways, so I think it's worth looking at because it's not insignificant.
Okay, I'm going to put myself in the queue here. Thea, thank you very much for that presentation. I've been following this process for a while because it's a really unusual one. How the sausage gets made sometimes is fascinating. So I was trying to figure it out just almost from a process understanding point of view. But having said that, there's a thing about the ramp, you know, the ADA, the grade separation, that's a hard one for me to swallow. It just doesn't sit well with me that we would have entrances that were not accessible. And I understand the letter of the law is, well, if one in the whole building is accessible, maybe you would meet the letter, but that doesn't meet the sort of universal access goal that we should be trying to achieve. And I just don't know if it overcomplicates it to say, well, you have to have a unified, you know, a lobby and an entrance to those units. Because if you have them grade separated and they're like a townhouse situation, I don't know how you're going to get a unified lobby and access to them. So look at that, see if that makes sense, if there's some way we can require they use a unified lobby, or if that just overcomplicates it incredibly. To me, the issue here is really about creating a comfortable pedestrian environment. And it has to do with separating the vehicle, you know, enough space between the car, the vehicle, and the building. And unfortunately, some of our streets are to the point where we've expanded them so far that there wasn't much room left for sidewalks. And now we're putting buildings right across that. So the issue is really, for me, the distance between the curb and the building. I know we can't go back in time and fix that, but part of putting these setbacks in then creates a much more comfortable distance there to be walking on that sidewalk so you're not walking by rapidly moving traffic. So my question is about the C2 zone, and I believe that most of those were along major traffic corridors where rapidly moving traffic was an issue. And if we were going to exempt the setback, we wouldn't really have solved that problem. So I'm wondering if you've done any research about, well, how wide are the sidewalks in those areas? Are we creating a much bigger problem by allowing an exception in those areas? So I'd be worried about the C2 and the rapidly moving cars. And then I think finally the idea that you could have a reverse step back, it's kind of the opposite of a urban code where you would typically you set back the upper floors as the building gets taller so that the sunlight can penetrate into the street and make that comfortable pedestrian environment. Our code already doesn't do that. It's 120 feet, 0 lot line all the way up. There are no, that I know of, there are no step backs. So we're actually talking about the reverse of that. And we wouldn't be making it any worse because we're already going up 0 lot line, 120 feet. So I'm intrigued by the idea that you could create some sort of reverse step back that would shelter the pedestrian and create that distance they might need from the traffic, the parked car, the bicycle, whatever that is that's making them uncomfortable as they walk down the street. So just to support for the reverse step back with some more staff research on that. See if you can figure out the C2, the width of the sidewalks. Are we just creating another problem? And then is there any way we can try to steer away from non-ramped entrances to residential units? So Commissioner Borowski.
Thank you. Just to give a little concept of where the idea came for the overhang. In Bologna, Italy, which is a university town, their land use or their building design back in the 1400s, they found that they had a need for more student housing. And so they put into their code that if you provided student housing, you could build out over the public right-of-way 1 meter. And so most people did that. And that's why when you go to Bologna, there are these beautiful walkways that are protected from the weather and protected from the hot sun and make for a very walkable environment. So that's kind of where that idea came from. And it's something that's over 500 years old.
If I may, Commissioner Ramey, I certainly hear, I just want to respond a little bit to your comment about that C2 area and what we typically see there as a development pattern. So I certainly hear your point about the problem we're looking at trying to solve and not creating a scenario where folks are walking along those busy streets. What we do typically see along our corridors are actually requests to push buildings back outside. So we do have a maximum 15-foot setback, but many of our corridors have really auto-oriented development. So think kind of along West 11th, the Fred Meyer's, the Dollar Store, all of those developments, they want the parking to be easy. And so more often than not, we tend to see those pushed back. We kind of thought it's a rare circumstance where someone may want that exception. And so we didn't really get too far into that, but I will certainly take a look at that question and see if there's any information I can provide on June 7th. I just wanted to give a little bit of context about what we typically see. And also thank you, Commissioner Borowski. I'm curious to look that up later and see if I can find some of the history on that. That's always interesting.
Well, I think a field trip is certainly in order. There's no way we could really figure it out unless we go there and look at it ourselves. So I'm sure Alyssa's going to arrange that for us. Commissioner Taylor. Oh, I think you're muted, Commissioner Taylor.
I lowered my hand, didn't unmute. So I was kind of trying to stay away from deliberations. So I echo what Commissioner Ramey is saying in terms of the vertical separation. I would love to explore that a little bit more, because if the idea is to have, so I guess I'd love to hear more about if windows are the key piece, do they actually need to be transparent? So if we were to allow it to be a grade and they could meet the 12 feet and 75% and they were residential, I guess my question is, did you receive feedback? Does it matter? I mean, if there were curtains and a developer wanted, if that was a driving force and they thought it, I'm just thinking about some of the multifamily development in Portland. It's actually quite vibrant and it just allows for design options. And are we over restricting this in a way that maybe isn't needed? I mean, I think it's a nice option, yet I think getting at Commissioner Ramey's concern, I guess I just would love to hear a little bit more information on that.
I really appreciate the points, and the ADA piece is something I've had some thoughts about from the beginning of this. We really thought that was kind of the option available through a code standard. And we proposed it because we're talking about an exception. So someone trading that lift of their building for coming closer to the property line. What I will note just on the windows piece, so having taller windows and the transparency, that would only be for commercial buildings. And then on the residential side, it would be vertical separation. There's not any sort of regulation with the windows. That would be with the ground floor or residential use.
I'm really clear about that. And what I'm actually suggesting is, can't we apply that to residential and allow so it would still have windows. And so as an option, if a developer wanted to come 6 inches or a foot into that setback and they still had the 12 feet, if they had high, I don't know, not saying that they would, but it gets to the ADA, there could be large curtain. I mean, there's ways that maybe there's some creative design elements, whereas from an aesthetic standpoint and your experience along the pedestrian corridor, could actually, you're not necessarily going to be able to see in. So if that's the objective, that there's full transparency, that might not happen. But I'm just curious to know if that was the objective, or if it's architectural elements and the possibility for some to be transparent and some to be not, be more opaque, but you still have the design elements and you have the high windows. There are some designs in Portland that do that, and they're actually done quite well. You still have privacy for the residents, but you have the design elements along the walkway.
Okay, are there other, yes, I see one commissioner with an additional question. Yes, Mr. Borowski.
Yeah, one more question, Althea, or Gabe, or anybody who's on the team. How many of the issues that council is trying to deal with this code amendment would be, or probably will be, addressed once the Complete Streets program is implemented? I mean, is that going to take care of 70% of our issues, or are we, putting one thing on top of another thing when it comes to that?
I'll jump in here. I think that the outcome with respect to the new Complete Streets design standards, it's difficult to sort of defer and rely on that from the perspective that, we're not reviewing specific dimensional requirements and street classifications in the context of this, right? That's part of the dilemma that I think staff faced in looking at this. And we really sort of squared off on this question. Well, the council's direction was very specific, and it did not focus, and to your earlier point, it did not really focus so much on amending the standards for the public realm in terms of you shall have an 8-foot or 10-foot wide sidewalk. It was very specific to the private side, right? To the private property regulation, and something that could be controlled in a relatively simple surgical way in a fairly quick code amendment process. And so really what this boils down to is a simple change of what was referred to as the default, right? To change the default from requiring no setback and no landscaping to requiring a minimum setback and minimum landscaping. And then there was discussion about, well, all right, so what are, there could be exceptions. There's certain design features that might make it okay to be closer to the street, but it really wasn't focused as much. And I don't think it's our charge based on the motion to really, and there's a dilemma there in looking at, I think, to Commissioner Ramey, Chair Ramey's question too, is like analyzing the extent of the different sidewalk widths and the various segments of different corridors. It's all over the place, honestly. There could be curbside, it could be setback with street trees. It's so context specific that it's hard to write code to respond to all of that in the context of a citywide amendment. And so, I think that's why we put an allowance for exception along C2 along key corridors that said, well, you could reduce the setback from 5 to something less than that, but not all the way to 0, right? With that notion of, hey, it's a busier street. It might be situations, typically, in my experience, where the sidewalk is curbside and it creates that feel of a kind of a dangerous environment along a busy street. So we wanted to hold that line, so to speak, where you still have room, a little bit more setback for what would be enhanced pedestrian space or landscaping, right? So just sort of trying to look at how we could most efficiently achieve that council goal with, a relatively quick set of amendments. So I don't know if that completely answers the question, but I know we have staff involved in those Complete Street design guidelines and the standards that are coming forth, but in this case, it's really not within our purview, at least as far as I can tell, to start tinkering with minimum sidewalk widths as much as we might like to.
So I figured that was probably your answer. There was a really good answer for that. So I appreciate the time and effort and creative thought you all have put into making this a surgical exercise and something that simply flips the standard to make the default something that it's not now. And I actually think that's a very clear way to do it. But once you provide us with exceptions, then we can't help but start looking into them. Sorry. So with that, are there any other questions, comments for the staff at this point on this item? Okay, I don't see any. So it's now 6:37 on my clock. We have our next agenda item. I think we're probably ahead of the schedule we thought we were going to be on, significantly, perhaps. But I would offer, if anybody wants to take a break, this is probably the logical time to do it. There isn't going to be another logic. Once we get into the next item, I think we're just going to want to keep going. So I would propose that if anybody wants to take a break, we do so now. And then we come back and say, I see some heads nodding. Okay, so is 10 minutes a reasonable amount for a break? Yes, okay, so we'll try to be back at 6:47, which is Apple time. I see Lauren's a little confused by that. It's 10 minutes, 6:37 now, plus 10, 6:47. Okay, see you in 10 minutes. And for that, we have Janessa here to walk us through the clear and objective housing task before us.
Okay. So yes, I'm Janessa Dragovich, and I was the project manager for the Clear and Objective project. I say was because council adopted the Clear and Objective amendments on April 12th. As part of the motion to adopt the ordinance as recommended by you, Councilor Zelenka made a friendly amendment to direct staff to return to you to consider an issue raised in the testimony they received related to the applicability of the new transition standards. Specifically, council received testimony asking that 2 special area zones be included in the applicability, the Jefferson West Side Special Area Zone and the R2 sub-area of the Special Chambers Special Area Zone were the 2 specific requests that they be added to the list of abutting zones that trigger the new standards. Hopefully you've had a chance to review the Ais packet and additional correspondence related to this specific issue. In the packet, we focused on providing background information and wanted to include from when the compatibility issue was first surfaced during the focus group sessions back in phase 1, and the evolution of the item as the project moved forward. As explained in the packet materials throughout the project, these standards were intended to apply when a high intensity housing development subject to a land use application is proposed abutting a low density zone. The example frequently used was a large multifamily development abutting the R1 zone. So as a reminder, the new transition standards will only apply to new housing development if the following apply. If the proposed housing development requires a PUD, a planned unit development, a site review, or a conditional use permit, those are the only 3 land use applications that these would apply to. If the development is for multifamily housing, assisted care, or rooms for rent situations. Note that there are built-in exceptions for triplexes on single lots, 4plexes on single lots, or when structures are kept at 30 feet or under. And the final determining factor is whether the development site abuts a low density residential zone. The 4 that were included originally in the ordinance that has been passed are R1, the R1.5, which is our row house zone, and then the R1 sub-area of the special chambers and the low density residential sub-area of the Royal Node special area zone. So also I wanted to give you a little refresher on what the standards do when they do apply. There's 3 options that developers can choose. The first option was the standard interior setback according to the base zone. So for example, in most residential zones, like R3 or R4, it would only be a 5-foot setback. Under option 1, though, they would keep the building height set at 35 feet for that 25 feet within the property that the transition buffer would apply. So that would have a bigger impact on R3 or R4 where the building height exceeds 35 feet. R2, the building height is 35 feet. So that's kind of not really achieving much. And then on the final part of that is the fence wall or landscaping requirement along the portion of the property line or any property line that abuts one of the triggering zones. The second option requires a larger setback, so a 10-foot minimum interior yard setback. It also has a slope setback that extends 25 feet into the property that gives you an additional kind of height restriction that graduates as you go into the property. And then it also requires trees to be planted every 25 feet along the abutting property line to one of the triggering zones, and a fence or wall also along that property line. Then option 3, the final option, is just a greater setback. It's a 25-foot interior setback for the development. And then the code section talks about what is allowable in that 25-foot setback area. So those are kind of the three options that could impact a potential development if these standards apply. The policy question for you is really whether or not R2 or any special area zone with a medium density designation warrants the same consideration as low density residential zones. So I've provided the background on how we kind of came to the conclusion and how the draft code was written and what our considerations were. And so hopefully now you can have a discussion, an informed discussion, and I'm here to answer as many questions as best I can. And I may call to some of my friends here that are with me tonight, other staff members. Oh, Commissioner, I think you're muted.
Thank you, Janessa. Commissioners, questions, comments for Janessa? Commissioner Fregola.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to ask a couple clarifying questions for the record, because I did re-listen to the council meeting. So will the clear and objective code amendments change the Jefferson West Side Special Area Zone Development Standards?
They will not.
They will not.
The development standards, and I tried to include that in the materials as well, but to be clear, they do still apply at the time of development. The clear and objective amendments don't impact them at all.
Okay, thank you. There seemed to be some confusion about that. This was a threat to the special area zone development standards. And am I correct in understanding that still any R1 that abuts any area in the Jefferson West Side or other R2 areas would still fall under the clear and objective code amendments?
I'm not sure I understand totally what you mean.
So any R1 that abuts these R2 areas would still fall under these transition guidelines?
So if there was a development that abutted that R1 area, yes. If it's zoned R1, then then these standards would potentially apply. Okay,
great. Thank you.
Commissioner Edwards, followed by Commissioner Broski.
You. I have a few questions, but I think I'm going to try to just start with just a couple. I'm reading through on page 17 of the AIS, specific to the new transition standards are intended to add additional design requirements when a high intensity housing project that requires a land use application is proposed abutting an area zoned for low density housing. So we have this situation. And in my recollection, when we had this discussion about this specific topic, we had very specific scenarios that we were looking to address. And so I guess my question is, did we ever look at any other zones or special areas or anything in the process? It wasn't my recollection that we had asked staff to provide any kind of analysis or any kind of background information that would sort of help us to see what that impact would be.
Correct.
Is that correct? Okay, so I have a lot of questions, and I'm just going to put this out there that short of any additional information that would tell me more specific to what the specific impacts are, what the specific properties that would maybe be impacted potentially, because again, it's with land use application, it has to be that trigger. I don't think anything different, there is no new information as far as I'm concerned, as far as like data that would help support a different outcome for me. So I'm just looking for any of that would help to understand that. And it doesn't sound like, you know, a thorough analysis. We didn't ask for that. Nobody asked for that. I don't recall this coming up in the discussions. And if I'm wrong, I apologize, but I don't recall this issue coming up until it was already, you know, coming to council. So in defense of staff, there was never, you know, never that request made. So I just kind of want to put that out there, that's information that I think for me, I would need to see something else that shows me what that impact and kind of provide some sort of reasoning. I did ask Councilor Semple, who had made that request, if she could be more specific, and I haven't seen a response. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. So I'll let others ask questions, and I'm probably going to have another round. So
Commissioner Borowski, followed by Commissioner Beeson.
Thank you. Yeah, for me, we have received a fair amount of input on this since it went to council and came back. We've received several emails and letters from individuals from the Jefferson West Side neighborhood. So I think for me, it makes sense to ask some questions regarding the testimony that was submitted to us. And I kind of understand a little bit of their thinking, how they would like this to apply there. And the way that I get there is, they're looking at transition standards between R1 and higher intensity development. And their thinking is that with the two sub areas that are mentioned, the density is a lot closer to R1 than it is to medium density. It's 15 dwellings per acre as opposed to 28 dwellings per acre for R2. And so I can kind of see where they're saying, well, if it's good for a density of R1 that's 14 per acre, why shouldn't it be good for us at 15 per acre? And I understand that may need some looking into. On the other hand, I also know that there's base zones throughout the city that are R2 that have single family housings on. And if we were to put these standards on all R2 going up next to R1, there would be major implications. I think the idea is going from higher intensity, which is R3 and R4, to R1. So I'm glad that we got the input from the neighborhoods that felt they felt that they should be included in this type of transition standards. Transition standards are something that the planning commission, since I've been on it, and even before I've been on it, has been something that it's been struggling with for years. How do you transition from lower density to higher density? So I'm just glad that we have the opportunity to look at this. The other thing that I do recall was a fairly robust discussion on these transition standards that Janessa described in her presentation. And we went back and forth, had a lot of input on those. And I think that we landed pretty good on what the transition standards should be. And so now it's just whether or not we apply them to the Jefferson West Side and Chambers area. So that's my take for right now.
Before we move on to the next question, there's a couple of points there that I'd like to respond to. A couple of things. One, the Jefferson West Side and the Special Chambers area, they both are considered medium density designations. And so while yes, 15 units per acre is close to the 14 units per acre that you can get with low density with the R1 zone, it is still within, it's just on the lower end of the range, or the spectrum, if you will, of what the density would be allowed. So there is a specialness to the treatment even of the density in that neighborhood. But it is a medium density designation on the Metro plan. And that was our clear, cut line that we took, and barring testimony or things that brought it up during the process. There was 2 years ago in April, March of 2019, we did get asked about special area zone inclusion. And at that time we did a staff analysis. Again, our lens was looking at low density designations. And so that was we didn't include, these weren't scooped up because of the medium density designation status of them. I do have a map that I threw together over the last few days just to give you an idea if you do want to see a little closer view of the zoning around those two special area zones. I'd like to point out, I'll share my screen in a moment, but I'd like to kind of draw your attention to a couple points, because there's also a misconception, I think, about how much these standards would do in this area, given the context of the area and the surrounding zones, and the fact that there's not a likelihood that there would be a site review. It's mostly the case of if a conditional use permit was required for an assisted care facility in that area, that would be, from what I can tell, that would be the most likely scenario that would trigger these if we were to apply them to the zone. So I'm going to share my screen real quick and then give you a better idea of that. Let's see. Can everybody see that? See Commissioner Ramey? Okay. So I put a note here to kind of not have to read everything or say everything out loud over and over, but this is the Chambers R2 sub area. This is the Jefferson West Side, is this portion here, as well as this little satellite area down here. These little kind of chevrons that I placed on here are calling out the boundaries that are actually abutting a zone outside of the special area zone. If you remember when you were formulating your recommendation and we were tweaking the transition standards, one of the changes from the original draft was to remove the applicability across alleyways. And so we always had it where they wouldn't be triggered across a street. However, originally they would have been triggered across an alleyway, but that was a change that was made. So given that, most of these boundaries, this is a street all the way across here. So there's this one C2 property right here that abuts these two properties. So this one could, if it converted and needed a land use application. Likewise, over here, you've got some that abut R3. However, most of these are developed and they're smaller lots. We're not going to see site reviews. It would only be if an assisted care facility or one of the rooms for rent situations that required a conditional use permit wanted to develop on one of these properties. This is an R2 zone that does have a PD overlay, so this would be a potential trigger area right here. Likewise, over here, there's R2 zone. However, there's no PUD overlay. So there's a little bit limited in terms of the possible triggers as well in this area.
Okay, I've got, thank you, Janessa. Commissioner Beeson, followed by Commissioner Taylor.
Can I'd like to make comments. Is that as opposed to questions?
Sure.
Okay. I just wanted to be clear. Janessa got into some of the stuff that I spent some time looking at, and I appreciate that. Also, I wanted to say, Janessa, I appreciate all the material, and I know it was very helpful to me, the way that you set it up, and the background information you provided. What I did, I was in a number of planning commission sessions when we reviewed clear and objective, but I wasn't in all of them. So what I did is kind of looked at what this was based upon the information we got in the backgrounder, and I pulled out the standards and I tried as best I could to take a good look at them. And where I came down, I realized there's probably aspects of the code that I know that I still need to learn about. But it feels to me like this request is really pretty simple. And the request is to add these two neighborhood designations to the list of the zone, like the R1 and the R1.5 and so on. We got some additional email that came through from the counselor. I know the friendly amendment said to consider R2, and I think Janessa framed the policy question for us pretty well, how we should just, should the R2 and these others, any other special area zone with medium density designation, should we be looking at or giving it the same consideration? We are low density or single family residential zones. So that was kind of the approach that I used on it. I took a close look at each of these, what she just put up there, and it became pretty clear pretty quick that the areas where this would even apply were quite limited. I think that I may have had a little more strict definition of the word abut. I'm not maybe remembering all the discussions. I didn't, when I looked at the word abut in the literature, and certainly in planning literature on how it's defined, it's adjoining property lines or shared property lines where they basically physically touch or border upon. So I won't, if the Planning Commission has said, well, gosh, that's going to apply to alleys, I'll not dispute that, but it certainly doesn't apply to streets. So anyway, it's pretty limited on where these would apply. And where I began to come down was, I'm not sure I see a problem with us agreeing to this and amending the transition standards to add these. I had some concern as I was trying to sort my way through some of the dialogue about it. I had some concern about the middle housing and potential impact on that, but I'm feeling pretty comfortable. I know we still have to talk about it and make decisions in our HB 2001 work, but I'm feeling pretty confident we're going to look at treating special area zones the same as the base zones in terms of middle housing being allowed across the city and what the requirements will be. So that kind of was not an issue for me. I guess it seems to me the only real question comes right down to, should we allow it here on the Jefferson area and the Chambers area, and then also on the R2. I did some looking at R2. The way I was reading the policy question is kind of the same thing. Where is R2 in the city adjacent to R3 and R4? Where might you have this kind of situation where you'd have this sort of high density housing put in right adjacent to low density residential? And it seemed to me it looked very rare. I couldn't hardly find any examples of it. And it didn't seem to me that we'd be hurting anything at all if we added it. And in fact, I think when I look at the Jefferson area and the Chambers area, I heard what Janessa said. I understand if it's treated as medium density, it's kind of a mix of single family and medium density. And it felt to me like it worked to go ahead and apply it. It's also, I think it's important to stress, these are extremely, I'm not suggesting insignificant, but these are extremely small areas in the context of all the R1 zoning that we have in the city. So maybe I'll just kind of leave it at that. I guess I'm kind of inclined to agree that we ought to make the change. So I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
And I'm going to share my screen real quick again, because I do have an R2 zone, a map that pops the R2 zone and abutting R3 and R4 zones. So on this map, this kind of purple color, these are all of the R2 zones throughout the city. And then the blue and the green are R2 and R3 and R4 rather. So the three colors you're kind of looking at are the purple for the R2, blue and green, and where the purple abuts blue or green would be potential areas that would require the application of these standards if you were to expand the applicability or recommend expanding the applicability to R2 or medium density zones as well.
Just to clarify, I'm staring at the part of it that's out by the Willamette River out there, and I guess
this
Beltline. Yeah, I guess. Anyway, there's a big purple chunk there that looks like it's in the good pasture area.
Uh-huh.
And then there's some blue around it. Janessa, could you speak to my discussion of the meaning of the word abut and how we use it? It's not really defined in our code that I could find. So where I'm looking at purple and blue separated by the Willamette River, I'm assuming that
does not abut.
Yeah.
It really does. We interpret abut to mean they're touching. The development site that has the proposed housing development that would trigger the standards would be touching a property zoned R1 or whatever the applicability is.
So when we say in the code, and I hear people talk and say, well, if it's a particular piece of property where somebody wants to do a development that's high density and it abuts the land, and the word land is used as opposed to specific lots, I'm assuming that you would just look at the lot line of the property that wants to do the development, and whatever properties that it would abut maybe one piece of property or two or three. It doesn't abut an entire 15 square block area, right?
Correct. You could have a site that's surrounded and has three sides that are abutting a zone that would need the protection. So that would be your kind of fullest extent that they would apply. If every single property line except for the street frontage was abutting a zone that would trigger the standards, then you would potentially have those 25 feet into the property. The standards would apply with to some extent. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
All right, Commissioner Taylor.
Thank you. I actually think this is quite complex. I don't think it's a simple, I think we were very thoughtful in our initial process, as mentioned. And I think, I do think equity is important and essentially so the Metro Plan designation underlying these special area zones is R2. And when we considered it, and as we approached and spent the time and multiple meetings, R2 was not part of that discussion. This is, I also see some of these special area zones, like if you look at the underlying designation of R2 and what that base code standards are relative to some of the special area standards, as Janessa said, the special area standards, they have particular instances that are actually further regulating beyond the R2 typical standards. So those aren't going away. Those will still be applicable. So as Janessa said, these instances are fairly minor in these two areas. And I think that I just feel uncomfortable in one meeting to decide to expand our scope to R2. I don't feel comfortable just applying it to these two special area zones. I really don't like the idea of the inequities that are potentially caused by special area zone, by looking at it in that way. I'm not saying neighborhoods aren't unique, yet I think I'm particularly sensitive to housing, and by us providing transition standards for R2, when we're trying to get more housing, And depending on what's adjacent, we could be minimizing housing opportunities. So I just would like more opportunity. I just feel like this scope is not it's not a small thing. It's actually it's much more, it's bigger. And so I'm inclined to I think we were thoughtful. I think staff was thoughtful. There was a very thorough process, and I'm inclined to stay in that position. I think adopting it, I love that City Council kind of adopted it. And what we can do is we are going to be addressing code standards as they relate to housing. We're going to have like the next chapter in relation to House Bill 2001. I think we're going to be looking more at some of the details in terms of impacts to housing opportunities and how we make those more available. So maybe there's I think the transition standards might even need to be looked at in terms of that, relative to that. So I just think this is much more complex. So that's kind of the position that I sit in. And I Commissioner Borowski, you said it really well. I also have a lot of compassion for these neighbors and the neighborhoods. And I think it's hard for a lot of neighbors to recognize that they might be sitting on a designation that is not what is currently developed on their parcel. So I think that's sometimes very hard. So you're looking around you and it's single family houses, yet the designation is R2, and our review did not include R2. So I have tremendous compassion and understand that request. And I do, that's how I feel. Thanks.
I'm going to put myself in the queue, and then I've got Edwards, Fregel, and Borowski after that. So the idea of the transition always seemed like a good one to me. High density housing project that was undergoing a land use process would be abutting an area zoned for low density housing. That seemed like perfect formula. I thought we did a good job of that. And so the question for me is the low density housing piece of it and R1 and the definition of R1 and how that compares to these two special area zones. And frankly, how do we get apples to apples? And where I started to look into was the dwelling unit per acre issue. The dwelling unit per acre, if I'm right about this, is 14 for R1. And if I'm reading what I've been sent correctly, and if it's actually true, it's 15 for these other two special area. And so that doesn't seem like a very big difference to me. So the fact that the Metro Plan designates it as medium density housing, the Metro Plan, as we know, is a pretty broad brush. Land use codes have 4 different divisions. Metro Plan only has 3. So we've already put R3 and R4 in what we call high density on the Metro, but not, we have R2 for medium. So it's almost like what we're being asked to do is look to the deeper level after the Metro Plan at these particular zones and try to get apples to apples with the R1. Because the idea behind the transitions still holds true. I'm just trying to understand if these zones we're being asked to consider are enough like R1, and is a 15 unit really a max for that area? If all that was true, I think I would be favorably looking on making the change for those 2 areas. I don't feel the same way about R2. I think R2 stays the way we left it by itself with the high level of units per acre. It's a different kind of thing. These are special area zones, and they're special. And a lot of work went into making them special. And if this 15 unit per acre max is actually true, then they're close to being R1, and I'm comfortable making an exception for them. So that's where I am on this one. And moving it on to Commissioner Edwards and then Fregula.
Okay, so thank you. I had different feelings about R1 than I do about R2. I feel like R2 is a denser designation. And the concept of in general of needing protections against something denser doesn't seem to sit well with me when we're talking about something denser than R1, which is R2. That is the base code, the base zone for at least Jefferson West Side. So when we start to expand that to denser areas needing protections against even denser areas, I think we start really limiting what we're able to do. And I think there are these unintended consequences. And I spent a ridiculous amount of time trying to study through all of this stuff and really understand the implications. And I could not figure out why so much time and effort is being dedicated to trying to make this change. I received an email to me personally that said, and I'm just going to read it because it's my email. Tiffany, you're a planning commissioner and you can't seem to understand the proposed amendment makes no change to SJW. Call or text me so you can stop embarrassing yourself and harming neighborhoods. If it does nothing, then why is so much effort being placed on this one issue? I have serious concerns because I can't figure it out, but I don't understand why, if it really does nothing and it will only apply to, to a once in a million type of land use application that's likely very unlikely to happen, then why is it? So I feel like there has to be some connection either to the implementation of House Bill 2001 or something else that I'm just not seeing. I'm really uncomfortable without knowing the full scope of what the implications of these decisions would be. And so therefore, I'm not saying I would never consider this change. I just think that I'd be more comfortable after the implementation of House Bill 2001, taking a look at it. And as Commissioner Zelenka just sent us an email moments ago, looking at all the special area zones, not just this one, not just two, but all the special area zones. Why are they special? Why would they merit this? I'm not comfortable singling any one of them out. And I'm definitely not comfortable with R2 because then that just starts to open up the gates for more and more and more in areas of our community that are actually prime to accept greater density. The topography is right. It is close to amenities. It's close to transit. It's very walkable. So if we are trying to add density and we can't do it in these core central neighborhoods and areas of our community, then where? So I have a lot of angst and heartburn over making a decision that could be this significant because I'm not convinced that it's not. And there are, dozens of emails and all kinds of correspondence going back and forth. And if it's really nothing, then why all the fuss? And so I'm not comfortable with it making a decision today, but I would absolutely keep the door open for consideration once we've implemented House Bill 2001 and we really see, how we are applying those provisions in all of the neighborhoods and all of the areas of the community. So that's kind of where my head is at the very moment.
Okay, I've got Commissioner Fragola, then Borofsky.
Thank you. So I hear people describing all of the input that came from Jefferson Westside community. I'd like to clarify that we've gotten many, many emails from one person, and maybe another person. But there have also been lots of emails, numerous emails in support of the work that we did on this process. Outstanding job and considered clear and objective amendments a major win for local housing. Applying low density standards to medium density zones could be problematic and lead to further complexities and challenges down the road. Eugene is experiencing a housing crisis and all neighborhoods are in this together. To single out a particular neighborhood is counter to the efforts made to date. That we did a deep dive on this with hundreds of hours and that it was a thorough and effective process. My favorite, to get closer to equity, we need to ensure all neighborhoods are held accountable, not wall some off. So I would like to address this Planning Commission's responsibility as relates to citizen involvement in Goal 1, which I feel significant responsibility to. When you look at the documentation that Janessa provided us, and it talks about the opportunities for citizen involvement throughout the multiple phases in the process that we looked at these clear and objective code amendments in. I can remember the focus group feedback and the number of people that participated in that process and the manner in which that information came to us, and that we used that as guideposts to help us develop these code amendments. We're not talking about the personal opinions of the Planning Commission here. We're talking about taking significant stakeholder input over multiple months and several years and synthesizing it into a recommendation to City Council. The numerous hours that came from stakeholders that work within the development industry and how they dug down into the fine detail. So when I think about my obligation as a planning commissioner, I think about my obligation to the thorough process that we committed to these code amendments. And then I think about, as a councilman put it, this last minute addition that has not been thoroughly thought out and that we do not understand the ramifications of. It just doesn't make sense to me. And I have to ask myself, is this an intentional circumvention of Goal 1? And it feels like it. It feels like an intentional circumvention of Goal 1. I feel very uncomfortable with not honoring the thorough work and all of the stakeholder input that went into this process. And I also agree with the commissioners present who spoke about not knowing what the ramifications, not knowing that this is a complicated issue. It's not just about a couple of instances that we don't know what the ramifications would be. And so I'm not supportive at this time of giving two small areas. Jefferson West Side is approximately 124 acres. It's 0.6% of all of the R-zoned residential area in Eugene. I'm not comfortable doing it at this time. And I can see how sometime down the road, after we get through HB 2001, as Commissioner Edwards recognized, after we get through all the other housing updates that Commissioner Taylor recognized, after we look at all of the special area zones, yeah, maybe we would get there. I think transition standards are great ideas, but not in this manner. This is not the way we should be doing planning in the city of Eugene. This is not a good process under Goal 1. So I personally would like to support and honor the fact that the city council adopted this code and celebrate that.
And Commissioner Borowski, followed by Commissioner Taylor.
Thank you. I can echo a lot of what Commissioner Fragelin said. She said a lot of the things that I would have said. Some of the points that I fall back on is the limited number of instances that this would apply. If there's a PUD, if there's a, I'm drawing a blank, but a shared housing unit or the very limited things that it went through. The other thing that I would like to say is it was a long process. It was a 3-year process to get cleared, actually longer than a 3-year process. 2017, I think, was probably when this began. And we could dig into these codes forever. You know, we could decide, I mean, look how long we spent on tree standards. Somebody could come up and say, I'm sorry, that tree standard is wrong. The critical root zone should be 10 feet instead of 8 feet. Go back and look at it again. So we could be at this process forever. I think we came up with a well-crafted code to the best of our abilities. Nothing is going to be perfect in writing code. There's always going to be exceptions that weren't thought of or could have been done better. That being said, I guess my question for staff would be, council asked us to bring back a recommendation. Are you looking for us to make a motion to one way or another regarding transition zones between R1 and higher density developments at this time? Or what are you looking for us to bring back, for you to take back to council? That would be one question. Because I think I can formulate one if that's what we're looking for. And then I guess I'll just leave it at that for right now.
Lauren, I'm looking at you. I'm thinking you might be the best person to answer what we're looking for to return to council.
So council asked for the planning commission recommendation, and one easy way to do that is by motion, because that would be, you know, the recommendation of the body. And I've been kind of scribbling in the background, coming up with some potential motion language. So when it's time, I can either read that out or put it in the chat for someone to make.
Aren't they in the packet? Could somebody reference the packet for us?
Janessa, did you include a motion in the packet?
Not a motion, but I gave kind of 3 possible options for the planning commission. They were high level.
What page are they on?
Page 18 of my packet, anyway.
And then one final little comment on this. I love this process. I love the fact that the city council had questions regarding certain parts of the ordinance and sent it back to us. I think that is absolutely appropriate. That was something that when a city councilor reached out to me and said, I'm not sure about this ordinance going forward. What do you think? I said, if you're not comfortable voting for it, please send it back. They felt comfortable enough with the ordinance to pass it and also send it back to us. So I think I applaud the city council for taking that step and letting us have this second look at the specific part of an ordinance that some of the members felt uncomfortable with.
So Commissioner Borowski, was your question answered about, are these 3 possible outcomes on page 18? Does that address what you were wondering about? You're muted, by the way.
I'm not sure. I'll have to go to page 18. But yeah, I think that I would hope that this commission will formulate a motion and a recommendation on this specific issue back to the council. How that's done, whether Lauren does it or whatever. That's what I'm hoping we can accomplish this evening.
Okay, so page 18 gives you that you can say leave it alone. You can say make some changes to it. And the third option, I don't think we need to check with the council about. That would be we're going to study it some more. So I'm going to move ahead now with Commissioner Taylor.
So I would like to make a motion. I do have something I'd like to contribute to that discussion, but I'd like to make a motion. And Lauren, I'm going to reach out since you've offered and you've been doodling. So if you would, my motion would be the first option, which is keep original recommendation. So any language you have around that is the motion I would like to make.
Okay, Commissioner Taylor, this is what I came up with. Move to recommend that the transition standards included in ordinance number 20647, which is the clear and objective update ordinance, not be amended to apply to R2 zoned properties or to special area zones with a medium density residential designation.
Great.
I second that motion.
There's moved by Taylor and seconded. Was that Commissioner Fragola?
Yes, it was. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. I have a couple people in the queue. I think we'll go ahead and honor the queue, and then we'll talk about, and you can talk about the motion if you want as well. But Commissioner Beeson and then Commissioner Edwards.
Commissioner Taylor should be allowed to speak to her motion.
Oh, yes, of course. Commissioner Taylor, you should be allowed to speak to your motion.
So I want to kind of address kind of the position that I'm coming from. It's multi-pronged. One is exactly what Commissioner Fragola discussed, which is effective public process. So goal one, I do think this, and I expressed it already, and I won't repeat it. Commissioner Fragola did an excellent job. The others, I want to kind of address what Commissioner Ramey brought up. I actually look at this special area zone, and I think looking and evaluating what's special about the special area zones as actually a down zone. So essentially it's sitting on, we have a land use process. We have a metro plan, which is a comp plan, and that plan basically guides our zoning base zones, our development code. It helps guide refinement plans. It is the overarching plan document for our community. It's got a designation of medium density residential. So essentially, these two zones are down zoning. So all other R1, all other properties that are sitting on that designation, if they get redeveloped and there's a land use application, it's going to force compliance with that metro plan. So many of these applications, like a CUP, one of the criterions says it needs to be compatible with our comp plan. So that property would be forced to be upzoned to R2. And essentially the specialness of this area is that they've downzoned a good portion of an area near downtown. So it's already got what I consider a lot of specialness to it. I'll just use that. So it just, especially in light of our discussions around House Bill 2001 and our housing crisis, not only in Oregon, but in the nation. And the significance of the housing crisis. So there is my other challenge with this. So, but mostly, and as Commissioner Edwards said and Fragola, if this is a discussion that we will have a more comprehensive discussion around this through our code amendments for House Bill 2001. So we can address transition standards in light of that discussion and have a more comprehensive, involved discussion. This does not feel like the right time or place to do this. This does feel, and I also recognize that, of course, you can always ask for what you want. We have a public process, so I'm not discouraging people from coming to City Council and expressing it. So similar to what Commissioner Brodsky said, I love that it was brought back to us and we're able to have this rich discussion, because there could be times that maybe we overlooked something. Maybe that thoughtfulness, we missed something. So I think the whole thing is wonderful, actually, quite frankly. And I think I appreciate this discussion, and I support this motion. And yeah, thank you for this, the ability to actually talk about it more, especially if we have concerned citizens. Thank you.
I've got Commissioner Beeson now, and then Commissioner Edwards.
Okay, thanks. And I'm going to support the motion. I will say that. I won't go through. I mean, as I mentioned, I spent quite a bit of time looking at these two areas and against the transition standard language, the way that I was interpreting it. and it felt pretty minimal to me, as I said. I do not, I appreciate what Commissioner Edwards said, Commissioner Fragala, Commissioner Taylor. I'm not at all wanting to do anything at all to minimize housing opportunities. And I fully understand there's dimensions to this that we just may not see. I think that to the extent we can bring it back and we can talk about it as part of HB 2001, or we can talk about it after, that would be fine. So it's a good opportunity for me to kind of learn a bit about it. I was thinking of the housing in that area as being kind of a mix of R1 and R2. I'm hearing that it's considered to be R2, and I appreciate that. So I think, it seemed to me that it was a fairly simple request on the part coming back from the council to take a look at this in terms of the special area zones and also R2. And I think maybe I'll leave it at that, but I'm ready to support the motion. So thanks.
Commissioner Edwards.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Fragala, for articulating so well what I was attempting to, many of the things I was trying to say. You did a great job. I think a kind of more of a question. As I mentioned, I'm actually supportive of revisiting this topic and not just shutting the door altogether, because I do think there is a valid discussion to be had. I have received a notice of intent to appeal on this issue as a interested party and someone who weighed in. So my question, I guess, is what would be most appropriate as far as like, I will support the motion and I will just say that, but I was willing to offer up some length of time or some commitment to come back and revisit this issue in particular, but knowing that there may be an active appeal, I think it makes more sense to allow that process to run its course and identify whatever potential errors that were made in this process. Absolutely supportive of that. So I guess I just, for my own sake, I guess I'd be curious from Lauren's perspective, would it be appropriate for us to even take another look at this before this matter kind of has its chance to play out? Or love your thoughts. Thanks. Sure. Well, just let me clarify my understanding of the kind of procedural posture of things right now. So as Janessa mentioned, the council did adopt the clear and objective update as an ordinance. It was approved by the council. It was signed by the mayor. And so that started the clock for a LUBA appeal. An appeal has been filed, but it's filed on the ordinance that was adopted by council. So what you recommended and what the council adopted. This question of whether transition standards should be applied to R2 zoned areas and medium density designation special area zones is outside the scope of that ordinance. So it's not part of the ordinance that was adopted, nor is it part of the appeal currently. So that's kind of one piece of the question. And then your question was, is it okay for Planning Commission to take that up or council to take that up? Yes. I mean, that's a question that's within your purview as the Planning Commission, and it's not currently on appeal. So I think, thank you. I think that what I will support the motion because I support the original recommendation, but I think just for the record, I'd like to just acknowledge that I think that the time that seems to be appropriate would be, in my opinion, would be after implementation of House Bill 2001 and any appeals that may come out of the ordinance that was passed by council. Despite the fact that this is actually kind of its own standalone issue, I do think that it would make more sense to just allow for that process to play out. So I'm in I mean, I'm not offering up to requesting of a follow-up work session. I just don't think it makes sense at this time. So I think that's what I'm attempting to say. So thank you.
Commissioner Borowski.
Lauren, could you read the motion for me again, please?
Sorry, one moment. Okay. Move to recommend that the transition standards included in ordinance number 20647 not be amended to apply to R2 zone properties or to special area zones with a medium density residential designation.
I would like to propose a friendly amendment that at the beginning of that, we say after careful consideration and deliberations, and then go into that motion, if that's acceptable to the maker of the motion.
Yes, that's acceptable to me.
Commissioner Fragala as a second. Is it acceptable to you also?
How would the motion read?
Commissioner Borowski, let me take a crack at it and you let me know if I got it right. After careful deliberation and what was the other piece? Oh, you're still muted. Sorry.
You're muted.
Muted.
After careful consideration and deliberations, and then into your motion.
So after careful consideration and deliberations, move to recommend the transition standards, etc. Not
Yes, I accept the friendly amendment.
That's all I wanted to do. Just to make clear to council, and I'm sure staff will present it that way as well, but it helps if it's in the wording of the motion, in my opinion.
So I'll put myself in the queue. I want to thank Commissioners, particularly Fragala and others, for pointing out the sanctity of the public process. Certainly in a community such as Eugene, that is first and foremost. It's what we strive to do. It's what we do over and over and over again. And I think this process followed that. However, if someone came to me at the 24th and 59-second hour and pointed out something that was actually in need of revision, I would give that full consideration. Simply that it was not raised until the end does not make it an unworthy idea. It does raise questions about whether the process was engaged by that individual earlier or should have been engaged by that individual earlier. But as a commission, I think we have the responsibility to weigh the merits of that idea, even if it came at the last second and perhaps in an awkward way. So having said all that, I'm curious about the distinction of, or the definition of medium density. It's mentioned in our motion, yet the petitioner, we'll call them, claims that their zone is not actually medium density. And so I think it would be worthy of us to include that is our conclusion, that these are medium density zones and that they're medium density because the metro plan, the underlying metro plan designates them as so, and because they allow 15 units per acre, which is considered medium density. So that, I'm just wondering if we can add that clarification to the motion.
I don't know if that goes to me. I'm not actually open to that clarification because actually the zones are not medium density residential zones. They are special area zones. They have particular meaning that are addressed within the code in the special area zones. They have medium density residential designations, but in terms of the actual zones, they have explicit meanings. So I don't want those special area zones to be referred to as R2 because they aren't, and they clearly aren't. Both of those special area zones have very particular things that are different than a straight R2 zone. So I'm sorry. Yeah, those distinctions are really important. So I'm not open to that friendly amendment.
So can you clarify your motion then?
I think I'm going to have to go back to Lauren, and maybe it does need to be modified because but I trust Warren, so
Yeah.
read it again, Warren, sorry.
Commissioner Ramey, the motion does reference special area zones with a medium density residential designation, which is the comprehensive plan designation.
Okay, that's the distinction I want in there. Tie it back to the comp plan. And that's that. I think it's important to explain how we got where we got. With that clarification, I will reluctantly support this motion. I do believe there was a reasonable argument made, but to be fair and apply this across the way we're defining it, I think is the way to go. So I will be in support of this motion. Are there others, or at least one commissioner we've not heard from yet? I don't know that everyone's had a chance to weigh in on the motion yet.
I'm in favor of the motion. I'm easy.
You are. Maybe you're hungry too. I don't know. Thank you for your full participation to all the commissioners. I don't mean to suggest that Commissioner Isaacson is not fully engaged. Sorry for that. I'm sorry, Dan. Yes, Commissioner Borowski.
Thank you. So this probably goes to Alyssa. So what do you see as this recommendation going forward? Is this going to just go to council as a memo? Is there a work session planned? I mean, can you just give me the rundown on how you think this will play out at the council level? Because a lot of times when we make recommendations, there is a work session involved with it.
Right. Well, because this isn't a formal process, we're not, this isn't a land use code amendment that you're making a recommendation on following your public hearing on the specific item. Our intention is to prepare a memo to, provide your motion, your vote, and the rationale behind it, a summary of the discussion. And that is our intention.
Okay, Commissioner Fregula.
I just wanted clarification. We haven't voted on this, have we? Okay. I think Commissioner Borowski's question just confused me because some of us have stated our intentions, but okay. I'm very close to moving to close debate, but I'll wait to do that because then you have to vote on that. So I'm not going to do it.
Don't do it. Thank you. Thank you for not doing that. I'm just sort of waiting. I'm keeping asking, but I'm close. I just want to be sure we've all had a chance to weigh in here before I do that. Let's give it a couple beats here. Okay. So hearing no further interest in further discussion, I'm going to move us into a vote on the motion before us. I believe that's the appropriate action at this time. All commissioners in favor of the motion as stated, please raise your hands where I can see them. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's a 7-0 vote. It's unanimous. I believe that's a strong message back to the council. And Alyssa, I'm eager, I'm hopeful, I'm anxious, literally using that word correctly, that the memo captures the spirit with which we engaged this issue, that we did deal with it in very serious ways, that we considered multiple aspects of it. And in particular, two items, I'm sorry, probably you'll have to filter this because I may not be right, but two items were, number one, the breadth of the change was so small as to maybe not require not the nature, how small the property would be, the number of properties that would be affected by this were so small. That was part of our, and the other part of it was there are other processes underway, particularly HB 2001, that will allow us to engage this issue in much more depth as we go forward. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but those are the things that occurred to me. Yes, Commissioner Isaacson.
I want to wait until after the vote to ask this, but do we think, given the complexity of the debate here, as well as what seems to be some pretty hot tempers in the community, that we should at least anoint some liaison from our body to be at the city council? I know Commissioner Edwards did last time, much to the chagrin of some folks, and herself, I'm sure. But that might be a pathway to kind of bypass any questions they might have beyond whatever letter we draft over to them.
I'm looking at Alyssa or Lauren for guidance on this.
Yeah, you know, at this point, we were just intending on submitting a memo. I think we'll give it some thought if there are other forms of communication, whether or not we weren't planning on a work session, which would probably be the most appropriate place to have a commissioner speak at. I mean, I think we can think about whether or not we want somebody to appear at one of the public forums to speak about it, but you're only gonna have 3 minutes there. So I think I'm just going to have to give that one some thought before we determine what more we do besides a memo. But thank you for bringing that up.
The only reason I bring that up is it's one of the things we talked about in our retreat was more collaborative efforts, and this is a perfect example to be able to do so.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
I agree. I agree. If we have the opportunity to do it, we should do it. The memo is a good first step, but if there's an opportunity to either sit at a virtual table or some other way in a work session that's appropriate, that appears to be appropriate, has the support of Council President, that would be great. All right. Are there other items for the good of the order here? Thank you all for extending your time today. I know we're extending our time later as well. I don't hear any more. So with that, I'm going to close. Whoops, sorry, one hand up. Yes, Commissioner Taylor.
I'm sorry, I wasn't quick enough. I just wanted to thank Janessa again. Really, I mean, even tonight, I really appreciate your being prepared. Like, we would ask a question, you had a map that identified. I just really want to give you accolades for that extra effort that you've put in. They were really helpful, the graphic maps you brought tonight. So I just wanted to, it was really, quite frankly, I think a lot of the process, your organization and preparation really helped facilitate a very thorough and thoughtful public process. So thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Borowski. Yeah, I just wanted to give a heads up to staff that I will not be able to attend the May 18th appeal. I will watch it, and I'll watch the webcast and be available for deliberations, but I'm not going to be able to attend that meeting in person.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Borowski. All right, last call. Okay, everyone, enjoy your evenings. Thank you for your time again. It was a lengthy meeting, but I thought we did, as always, we did good work. So we'll see you next time.